This video is going to be so long. In my first year of college, I wrote a fairly lengthy research paper on the subject of exploitation films, an often misunderstood term that refers less to the content of a movie than its marketing. And while you can really trace the concept all the way back to the white slavery films of the 1910s or the educational films of the 1930s like The Birth of a Baby and Tell Your Children, which was later re-released as Reefer Madness and inspired a very enjoyable off-Broadway musical, exploitation films as we think of them today came as a natural evolution of the B picture. You see, a B movie was a low-budget companion piece that theaters played alongside bigger A films to justify ticket prices, since audiences were getting two movies for the price of one. But at some point, folks like Roger Corman realized that you didn't need the A movie at all. By doubling up on Bs in popular, easily marketable genres, you would be able to sell plenty of tickets while spending a whole lot less on production. In doing this project, I got a pretty good sense of the American exploitation scene, but I never delved into equivalent movements in other parts of the world. Now, I've seen a couple of Taiwan's black movies, some Italian giallo, and enjoyed the classic doc Not Quite Hollywood, the wild, untold story of Ozploitation, but it was never with an intent to go deeper. Until last week, when I found myself staring down a rabbit hole of Japanese Sukeban, or girl boss films, a subgenre of pinky violence movies, which were themselves either a subgenre of so-called pink films or an adjacent one, depending on how actively pornographic your dictionary requires a pink film to be. And all it took was the misidentification of a few seconds of projected footage played at a key moment in what I have just now determined is my favorite film. Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week I Review. You can call me Waiting for Cancellation. And today, I am talking about Assassination Nation. Writer-director Sam Levinson was a big deal a couple weeks ago when it was announced that he had secretly shot a feature last month with Zendaya and John David Washington called Malcolm and Marie. Since domestic production effectively stopped as a result of the pandemic, everyone has wondered what it would look like to bring people back to work. How do we make movies in the age of coronavirus? And now we know, thanks to Zendaya itching to get something done while Euphoria Season 2 is on pause. She asked Levinson, the series' creator, to make something with her, and he did. Working with legal teams and the various unions, they put together a laundry list of extremely specific rules that will surely be the blueprint for anything that gets made in Hollywood until there is a vaccine or at least a real treatment. I loved Euphoria and definitely would have reviewed it on this channel had I been less strict about my Monday upload schedule before the timelessness of quarantine made me throw that right out the window. As HBO's first ever teen drama, it successfully reached the younger demographic that is crucial to keeping a brand alive in the long term, which seemed like great news until the parent company diluted it all by themselves with the release of HBO Max. Seeing Levinson's name in the news reminded me that his most recent feature, a searing indictment of American culture, which premiered at Sundance in 2018 and shares more than a passing resemblance to the series that followed it, is available on Hulu, and that I hadn't seen it in at least a year. And hey, I figured it's probably gotten even more relevant in that time, and I was right. At the start, you would be forgiven for thinking that the movie was a Purge spin-off. Over Black, we hear voiceover from a young woman we haven't met, but will soon learn is the film's protagonist. This is the story of how my town, Salem, lost its motherfucking mind. We open on a young boy, Danny Torrencing his way down a suburban street to Ennio Morricone's Unexpected Violence, a track from Dario Argento's debut, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. As the boy passes houses, we see that everyone in the neighborhood is wearing Halloween masks. Watering the flowers? Mask. Taking out the trash? Mask. Checking the mail? out for a walk, just standing in the driveway. Mask, mask, mask. Even the boy on the bike is wearing a mask, and on it, an American flag. He looks at the camera, and we are told that things are going to get a bit graphic. A series of trigger warnings ensue, all written on screen over accompanying footage from the film in red, white, and blue. Bullying, blood, abuse, classism, death, drinking, drug use, sexual content, toxic masculinity, homophobia, transphobia, guns, nationalism, racism, kidnapping, murder and attempted murder, the male gaze, rape, attempted, sexism, clarified to deaf sexism, swearing, torture, violence, gore, weapons, and fragile male egos. You get all that? I sure hope so, because we're going to talk about most of them, directly or not, over the course of this video. When I first saw the film, this sold me. Less than 2 minutes in, I was fully on board with whatever the fuck Sam Levinson had in store. Because substance is all well and good, but I'm not going to pretend I don't prefer it in a ludicrously over-the-top, lavishly produced package. Hence Joseph Kahn's Detention being my go-to favorite movie for so many years. The voice is Lily Colson's. She's a high school senior in the fittingly named town where residents will soon decide they want her and her 3 best friends, Bex, Em, and Sarah, dead. Not because of anything they've actually done, but because of false accusations obtained through actual torture that people accept as fact. Because someone needs to pay, and why not a bunch of high school girls? In modern-day Salem, America, the crime isn't witchcraft, but a massive invasion of privacy. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the town are hacked, and their photos, texts, search histories, everything are made public on 4chan and then downloaded by everyone there and beyond. Cue a town eating itself. In June of 2019, actor Bella Thorne released nude photos of herself online. Not really because she wanted to, but because some gross man had been threatening to post them, and she refused to let that be held over her. She took her power back. This adds an interesting paratextual element to a scene in Assassination Nation, where actor Bella Thorne says to our protagonists, "I'm sorry, but I just don't have, any sympathy for people that get their shit hacked." And her real-life act of defiance feels like the logical conclusion to this. She continues, there's 2 types of people in this world, the people that have come to terms with privacy is just dead, and then there's the old people that are still trying to fight it. Literally, while writing this script, I happened to check my spam folder and find an email from someone who claimed to have hacked my shit. They had control of my computer and all of my accounts. We see the film's hacker, who goes by the handle Aristratus, turn Lily's webcam on remotely, and this person claimed to have done the same for me. And wouldn't you know it, I'd been caught masturbating. Awkward. So I sure had better pay $1,200 in Bitcoin, or that footage would be sent to all of my contacts, alongside all of my private communications. Now, it was very clear that this was an empty threat. It's even less specific than the phone call I got a few months ago from a woman who called me Mr. K and said she needed my full social security number before being able to talk to me about some very important business. But even if it was true that they had compromised my system, which they didn't, they don't have that video of me. Not because I've never masturbated, but because my laptop's webcam is literally hidden beneath the keyboard. Turn it on all you like. There's nothing to see. But I agree with Thorne's character in that I believe most people under the age of 30 have come to terms with the fact that this sort of thing really could happen to them. I go through life assuming that I have no real digital privacy, and on some level that has affected my online behavior over the past decade. But I was fortunate enough that I got to make a choice. In 2011, I decided to begin writing under my own name. Prior to that, I was Douglas Adams, because I sure do love The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and using a famous person's name guaranteed that no matter what I said or did online, no one would ever be able to find it or me. At 19, it seemed okay to finally be Alec Kubas-meyer, and so I shed those various internet handles that dated all the way back to middle school. In the wake of this, I did a Google search for those old names, which I'm sure someone could find if they were to successfully hack all of my accounts, but most of the websites I frequented back then are gone. The rabbit hole leads you to a handful of dumb forum posts on IGN, a very poorly written review of Resident Evil 4 on GameSpot, and a rather embarrassing complaint on fanfiction.net. I don't want anyone to see any of that, but also, it wouldn't really matter if they did. I also don't want people to see my personal messages, but it's not because I'm worried about some sort of major backlash. I would possibly get fired, since I'm sure I've said rude things in private about my employer, just like everyone else in the world, but I probably wouldn't lose many friendships, and there wouldn't be a hashtag. But that's because my edgelord phase, wherein I did things like link to a particularly gross image called ultimate.jpg in my AIM profile and claim it was my Zanga, my ideal YouTube audience understands 2/3 of that sentence, no more and no less, is lost to time and shuttered servers. And thank fuck. Because even if some of it reflected who I was at the time, none of it reflects who I am now. I had childhood as an excuse back then, but the knowledge of what I've said makes me far more inclined to forgive people for transgressions made years in the past. Philip DeFranco talks about this a lot whenever he's covering the mob target of the day, and I agree that judging someone by the content of their character 10 or 15 years ago is at best a waste of everyone's time, and at worst actively counterproductive. Everyone has shit in their past, and some people are just better at hiding it. But that isn't to say that we shouldn't ask a person to publicly reckon with their past mistakes or actively denounce their failings. We should. Hell, most of the videos on this channel have some of that reckoning in them. I think a lot about how my younger self would see me now, and I know he would hate me, and I'm glad. But it is to say that folks should consider why they want to attend someone's over party. What is the purpose of that hashtag? Is it to bring attention to someone's bad behavior so that they can apologize? And if they apologize like Dan Harmon instead of Louis C.K., then everything's good? Or is it to bury them? I tend to doubt the masses' good intentions. Real talk, I have been the target of an internet mob, and it was one of the most stressful things that's ever happened to me, despite it being the smallest fraction of what many people face. Just over 5 years ago, I wrote an article about women protagonists in video games for the Daily Beast. My editor wanted me to mention Gamergate, so I did. I called its apologists a bunch of petulant children, and he put Gamergate fail in the headline. People got real mad. It wasn't great from the outset, but the turning point was a tweet where someone called for a boycott of the Daily Beast's advertisers specifically so that I would be fired for having written that. Now, I was a very occasional freelancer rather than an actual employee, but I sure as shit didn't want to have my name forever associated with some massive cancellation campaign. Whether the Daily Beast cared or not, other potential employers would have. I just wanted it to go away. And this was 2015, and I was an idiot, so I actually tried to engage with some of the haters. But Twitter is where context goes to die, and so everything I said was used in isolation against me in an article on a right-wing news website that you have heard of, written by a man that you have forgotten about, but whose name you would recognize if I said it, which I won't. Fortunately, this didn't go anywhere. The guy who called for the boycott ultimately deleted his tweet, and then everyone denied that it had ever existed. And while I got a couple of threat-like messages, it all fizzled out after a few days. It gave me the slightest glimpse into what it's like to be the subject of a true mob, and I cannot overstate how awful an experience it was for me to see so much constant vitriol being thrown my way on Twitter, Facebook, in my email. It felt real and personal, even if it was neither of those things. And despite all that, When Salem's anti-gay conservative mayor in Assassination Nation is outed as a hypocrite who hires male escorts, I was totally with everyone who called for his head. And when he gave it to them, Bud Dwyer style, instead of owning up, I thought, good. Bex, who is trans, says it best. He wouldn't mourn my death, so why the fuck should I mourn his? But Lily doesn't think it's that simple, and the next hacking is why. Enter Principal Terrell. Within the contents of his phone, people find photos he had taken of his daughter naked in a bathtub. Now, to me, that seems fine. Parents take photos of kids in the bathtub, and people tend to not be wearing clothes while bathing, right? Like, guess not, because the folks of Salem start screaming for the resignation of this pedophile, child molester, etc. Lily argues with her Karen of a mother that the gross puritanical culture is sexualizing something that is not at all sexual, but she refuses to hear it. Lily's father says that he started feeling uncomfortable seeing her naked around the age of 2. And honestly, that's way more discomforting. Nudity is not inherently sexual. It is the context that sexualizes it. Which brings us back to our intro. I entered the pinky violence sub-subgenre under false pretenses. There is a scene a little over halfway through Assassination Nation where the 4 girls are watching a film projected onto the ceiling. A bunch of women in red trench coats are walking down a neon-lit alleyway. Japan, clearly 1960s, probably. I knew I wanted to watch it, both because it looked cool and because I hoped that I might be able to find some interesting connections between the 2 films that would make this review worth watching. But I couldn't find a name in the credits, so I just Googled, what movie are they watching in Assassination Nation? That brought me to an article about how the costuming was inspired by Sukeban films, and specifically Stray Cat Rock Delinquent Girl Boss. So I checked that one out. It was the wrong movie. But before I realized that, I was struck by a particular exchange that happens about a third of the way in. A bunch of men are threatening the female gang. One of the women says, "You can't take our freedom and control us with your power." And a man responds, "What if we don't like the freedom you're talking about?" I imagine it's less clunky in Japanese. And that felt very true to the spirit of Assassination Nation. And also, like, America? Freedom as a concept has long been confused in this country. The people who rage about it are those who believe it's only for them, and that their freedom requires the ability to restrict others. They would never acknowledge this, and one could too charitably say they don't even really know it. But that doesn't mean it's not true. It's why the townsfolk who are hunting down 4 teenage girls can have a rallying cry, like, "We're good people." After some more digging into Sukeban films, I found an article containing an image of those same women in their red trench coats, and a new name, Delinquent Girl Boss, Worthless to Confess. You can see how the fashionista writer could get confused. The film's subtitle, Delinquent Girl Boss, has basically no nudity, while the 5th and final film in the Delinquent Girl Boss franchise uses it pretty sparingly. But more importantly to me, there was no sexual violence. Let's be real. I'm not going to complain about seeing more bare breasts than are strictly necessary. As long as the context is consensual, I'm a fan, sue me. And I thought maybe that was going to be widely true in this genre, so I had mapped out the next few movies I would be watching over the course of the last week, planning on getting at least a half dozen in during the writing of this review. But that was cut short by Noribumi Suzuki's 1973 film Sex and Fury, which seems to be regarded as among the best of all the pinky violence films. At first, I was into it. An early scene features protagonist Ocho being attacked while bathing by a number of sword-wielding goons. She immediately leaps out of the bath, grabs her own sword, and dispatches the whole lot of them while completely naked during a beautiful snowfall. And for a movie called Sex and Fury, the camera is shockingly restrained. It seems designed to empower Ocho rather than sexualize her. These men came in expecting to find her at her most vulnerable, and for that arrogance, they die. I really like this scene a lot, like a lot. And then the movie squandered all of that by featuring a whole bunch of rape and rape-adjacent sequences, as well as a half-naked Ocho being literally whipped for way too fucking long. Not that there's really a good amount of time for that. I pushed through it, skipping the more graphic scenes because honestly, fuck that. But the interest I had had in this subgenre largely evaporated by the time the credits rolled. Reading synopses for the rest of my list made it clear that those first two films were the exception and Sex and Fury was the rule. I understand that salaciousness was a large part of these films' allure. As censorship laws became more lax, boundaries had to be pushed, and fetishistic images of rape and torture certainly pushed boundaries. And this also wasn't an exclusively Japanese issue. The 1970s may have been the golden age of Hollywood, but it was also the golden age of the rape revenge film, here and everywhere. Fortunately, Assassination Nation wasn't inspired by that particular aspect of Sukeban films. The torture is not titillating, and the sexual content isn't particularly explicit. The only leaked photos we ever actually see are lingerie shots rather than full-on nudity. They're Lily's, as it turns out, or of Lily, found on the phone of the married man for whom she was once a babysitter, who is listed in her phone as Daddy, accompanied by the heart eyes emoji. She's aware enough to have not put her face in any of them, but when the contents of his phone are leaked, there's a lot there. And suddenly, you start to see patterns, especially if you are her psychologically abusive boyfriend. Lily's emotional infidelity is an interesting wrinkle in her character. Of the girls in the group, she is thus the least objectively sympathetic, but that's why it's important that she's the face. Maybe you scoffed at her when she said, "I'm not a bad person," when Bex reminds her that he has kids. But that doesn't mean she deserves what happens to her, even before the guns come out. She made some mistakes, but she's also in high school. I get the anger of the people close to her. Hell, if I was in Pennywise the Clown's position here, I'm sure I would envision doing something similar. But watching it all play out from her perspective makes that not matter. Regardless of how bad you think she is, there is no redemption in seeing her literally dragged screaming from her house. These are the moments where Assassination Nation feels its most real, and I appreciated Levinson's decision to tone down the heightened imagery and let the heightened emotions bring the drama. In my junior year of college, I was showing Joseph Kahn's Detention to a group of friends in my dorm room. It was my fourth or fifth watch at that point, and I prefaced the screening by saying that it was a pitch-perfect depiction of the high school experience. When the credits rolled, one of them, who I had a severe falling out with less than 6 months later, though unfortunately not before we decided to live in the same on-campus housing the following year, looked at me and said, "What the fuck kind of high school did you go to?" And if you want to be superficial about it, sure. Kahn is best known for his striking, deliberately crafted music videos. And that pedigree shows. Detention's camera is constantly doing interesting, extremely specific things. It can be distracting when a debate is filmed with 66 separate camera setups and movements rather than a handful of traditional shots cut together. But if you give into it, you'll find a film that is using this heightened reality of student serial killers and time-traveling bears to represent how apocalyptic high school feels for a lot of kids. Certainly, it was how my senior year felt for me. And seeing Detention just 2 years after graduation, I didn't need to strain to remember that. It hit hard, and it stayed with me. Arguably, Assassination Nation is even more stylish, which is fascinating because Levinson doesn't have that same history. His background is mostly acting and writing, with only one feature under his belt, 2011's Another Happy Day. Like Assassination Nation, that film is about the social boiling point, but it's more focused, a dysfunctional family forced together to celebrate a wedding. It's fine. It succeeds in making you very uncomfortable as cultures and generations clash within the confined space of this house where everything is taking place. The writing's good, the performances are very good, the direction is solid if uninspired. Thematic connections between Another Happy Day and both Assassination Nation and Euphoria are clear, but aesthetically, he's become a whole different director. Though I expect that Malcolm and Marie will probably look more like his debut because Levinson is a firm believer in matching the style to the content, and it seems likely that film is more straightforward than his most recent projects. Now, of course, everyone should be matching their style to the content, but few directors have swung as wildly as he has. Another Happy Day would not be better if it had Assassination Nation's spinning camera and vibrant lighting, and I can't think of many family dramas that would, even accounting for how much I enjoyed the first half of Trey Edward Schultz's Waves, the cinematographer for which would go on to collaborate with Levinson on several episodes of Euphoria as a direct result of his work on that project. But Assassination Nation isn't about family. It's about society, which is a thing that we live in. But it's really about society as it has been shaped by the internet. Because if you haven't noticed, the internet is fucking wild. I spend probably an hour a day scrolling through TikTok and going from videos of creepy geese to economics lessons to complaints about dating while millennial to cats to Karens to dogs to frogs to whatever the heck else that sweet, sweet algorithm sees fit to give me. Well, it just addles the brain. And the film must match that relentlessness. It moves at a clip that never gives you the time to be bored or look away, and if you do, you're going to be punished for that. So many scenes play out in parallel with dialogue from one playing over images of another. If you stop paying attention, you'll be like me coming back to Twitter last Wednesday after a few consecutive hours working on this gosh damn review. I opened my feed, and a friend of mine who I've mentioned a couple of times on this channel, 700 something followers, suddenly had tens of thousands of retweets on a still he posted from Parasite to reflect the state of Twitter in that moment, and I had no idea what had happened to inspire that. I had missed the hacking of some of the most powerful people in the world, and then the brief silencing of verified Twitter that followed. So I logged in to find a flood of memes I didn't understand. There's a compilation on YouTube of deleted and extended scenes from Assassination Nation, and it's fascinating to see how certain moments had been condensed or recontextualized, how one bit that ultimately became just a few seconds of a montage was originally a full-fledged scene, but it wasn't necessary. While some of these had poignant commentary or expanded on certain characters in interesting ways, it would have taken away from the film's constant propulsion. In an interview with Film School Rejects, Levinson said that everything is spectacle. Everything is entertainment. And he committed to that idea in making this film because it really does use that spectacle to pull you in and keep you there. There are so many gorgeous visuals in the film, with perhaps the obvious standout being that awesome home invasion oneer. But there's a particular underutilized lighting technique that he uses a few times, and one I noticed in a couple of the Sukeban films, which is dramatically motivated lighting changes. Even when movie lighting isn't aiming for realism, it's rare for lights to change in ways that don't have any diegetic justification. Let's look at this one shot, which is among my favorites in the film. This comes as things are going to hell and three increasingly intense scenes are being intercut. The jocks deciding that one of their own should die for having sex with Bex, Lily's boyfriend confronting her, and Grace taking revenge. We've seen Grace a few times, hanging around with Bella Thorne's character, Reagan, but when the latter's phone is hacked, we learn that Reagan has been sending out Grace's nudes because it's funny. And so Grace comes to school, makeup smudged from tears, holding a bat. She comes into the gym where Reagan is dancing with the other cheerleaders. You know what? Let's do this one part full screen, proper video essay style. Don't get used to it. Historically, copyright has had nothing to do with the way that I use footage in these videos, but it's apparently something I'm going to have to account for going forward. Unfortunately, this next section of the video was claimed by a German subsidiary of Universal, and not only did they claim the revenue, which doesn't matter because this video won't be popular enough for me to really care about that, but they also blocked it in almost every country. It would only be available in Germany and Austria. And as much as I like people in Germany and Austria, got family there, fuck that, you know? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna sit over here and I'm gonna point, and then the footage will take up as much of the screen as it can, and hopefully that will be enough to stop the Content ID bots. So let's do that. Past Grace's legs, we see those cheerleaders. Through them is Reagan. The audio is a continuation of the jocks calling themselves the Slam High Killers from the previous sequence. The camera lifts up. We see Grace's bat, and then it flips over her head, and we see her determination and realize that she's in front of an absolutely enormous American flag. The camera remains upside down and pulls back. As it does, the light on Grace goes out. And now we've got this haunting image of a bat-wielding silhouette against the flag. She has lost herself and become part of the machine. The shot keeps going, and Lily's narration picks back up. Because it's all just a movie, right? And the camera pulls past Reagan, and we watch her dance. And then the camera shifts to the side just a little bit to remind us that Grace is still there, waiting for her moment. One that she will be applauded for by the other students as she's led away in handcuffs. America, am I right? If the only time you've ever seen me was briefly in the bottom corner of this shot in the plot against America, you might be surprised to learn that I'm not particularly patriotic, but it really runs deeper than that. I don't get patriotism. Why would you be proud of something you had no control over? And saying that puts me close to some real dangerous territory, and I want to acknowledge that that statement comes from a place of privilege. I don't need to feel pride in who I am because I am literally the default, a straight white cis male. And because I'm the default, I'm not defined by any of those traits. I get to be defined by the kind of person that I am and the things that I do. If you're part of a marginalized group, I see why it matters to be proud of who you are because other people want to tear you down for it, and you should shove your pride right into their stupid fucking faces. But being proud of whiteness, straightness, cisness, maleness, Americanness is so boring and lazy. Like, get over yourself. Something I imagine many people thought when they stopped watching this video 20-something minutes ago. Sam Levinson started writing Assassination Nation in 2016. His wife was about to give birth, and he was watching in real time as his country destroyed its global standing. He was considering what kind of world he would be bringing his kid into. Clearly, he didn't think it was a great one. He wanted the film to be something of a wake-up call, that people would see the reality of it in its insanity and pause to reflect. And while that's perhaps slightly arrogant on his part, he believed that that reflection might inspire conversations that could move things forward. America is in this sort of standoff, he told Seventh Row, and standoffs don't normally end well. Indeed they don't, and ours hasn't. It's only gotten worse in the years since. 2020 has been a shit show in every conceivable way, and it's not clear to me that it will get better in the second half. The metaphorical standoffs have, in many cases, turned into literal ones, except the standoffs have generally ended with police beating up unarmed protesters, because that's what they do, and are still doing, even if the media has gotten bored of covering it, because the police are bad, and the system they're a part of is bad. I mean, shit. Have you seen what's going on in Portland? Unidentified federal agents in full-on military gear are straight up taking people off the streets and detaining them without charges. Like, that's straight up police state fascism. One of Assassination Nation's deleted scenes features a recurrent cop who is just The absolute worst. He's the one who starts the "We are good people" chant that the Salemites do when they're going after 4 high school girls. The guy is berating Em and Sarah while his partner just stands there and does nothing. After he leaves, Em, who is black, says, "I fucking hate the police." And why wouldn't she? As a white guy, I'm generally not worried about a police officer killing me or whatever, which is nice, but that's about all they've got going for them. Did you know that in 2005, the Supreme Court, which is another institution that should just be fucking abolished, determined that police have no constitutional obligation to protect people? They rarely stop crimes in progress and don't solve them after the fact nearly as much as television would like us to think. So what's the point? I see value in law enforcement as a concept, but not in the structurally racist institution that we've currently tasked with it. Back to that "We are good people" chant. The pandemic has really highlighted how fundamentally selfish so many of us are. Not all Americans or whatever, and sure, while mask compliance in my neighborhood has dropped a bit from its high of around 95%, I would say it's still above 2/3. But also, the governor of Georgia is literally suing Atlanta for trying to enforce mask usage, and there are a depressing number of people who think that he's right to do so. I have no doubt that at least most of these selfish fucks who refuse to wear masks or do literally anything that isn't explicitly to help themselves believe they're good people. Obviously, they're wrong, and people are dying as a result. Hundreds every single day in the United States of America. It didn't have to be that way. In other developed countries, it isn't that way. I once worked with someone who had a racist Twitter account, who I and others reported to HR on multiple occasions. He told me that he would win any argument because he was speaking with reason and fact, while I, a liberal, was just using emotion. Being younger and dumber, I engaged. Until one day, he gave up the game, saying, "I reject anything that doesn't align with my principles." My jaw literally dropped. The cognitive dissonance of a man saying, "I only use logic, you're the emotional one," and "I reject anything that doesn't align with my principles," is mind-boggling. But it explains everything. That's American exceptionalism at work. Everyone is exceptional. He knows what's right and how things work purely by virtue of existing in America, and they are the exception. He definitely doesn't wear a mask because he undoubtedly believes that he won't get sick if he believes it exists at all. And he definitely wants schools to reopen because scientists who believe that they shouldn't are saying something that gets in the way of his worldview. And so he shuts off, like the fragile little snowflake he is, and projects everyone around him to be. Last Thursday, I watched the first live theater performance I had seen since the pandemic began. The MCC Theater in New York has done a couple of Zoom readings, and I unfortunately missed one featuring Oscar Isaac, but I caught Caitlin Dever and Julianne Moore performing the 1994 one-act Good as New. I really enjoyed it, but I couldn't help thinking about the fact that this play about women's experiences was written by a man, Peter Hedges. I don't believe that men can't write women's stories or that straight cis people can't write queer stories, etc., but it needs to be done with extreme humility and an understanding of one's own limitations. In the post-show talkback, Hedges deferred to the performers on multiple occasions since they could speak to the actual experiences far better than he could. And that showed an understanding of his place in all of it that I respected. In interviews, Assassination Nation's actors have said that Levinson sought their input and asked them how their own experiences could be put in to make the portrayals more true to life, as long as doing so would be healthy rather than traumatic. Levinson himself said that he tends to rework dialogue after actors had been cast to better match the words to the people who would be saying them, but he also gives them leeway to improvise and really make the characters their own. And I mean, He's a white dude in his 30s telling a story about internet native teenage girls. There's a point at which the experiences are just too disconnected, and his openness to letting his performers shape the world goes a long way towards making it all feel authentic, yes, but also not exploitative. On this most recent watch, I found it fascinating that even though there are characters who hate and try to literally lynch Bex in the street, no one ever deadnames or misgenders her. The suffering is physical then, more than it is psychological. And it reminded me of the broader discussion around these forms of harassment and abuse that has recently resulted from Lev's subplot in The Last of Us Part 2, in which he, a trans boy, is subject to both. When I reviewed the game for the Daily Beast, I didn't mention that aspect of it, nor the game's broad diversity more generally, because while it seemed cool that it was there, I honestly didn't know how others who saw themselves in Lev and the others would take it, and my opinion wasn't relevant. And having now read pieces by trans writers who have largely mixed feelings about it, I'm even more glad I didn't try to weigh in outside of one tweet at the end of a thread that no one read. Because as much as I feel qualified talking about a broad range of topics, I make an effort to understand when I don't. I'm not always successful, and I've probably overstepped at least once over the previous 6,300 words. But I want to be better and use what little platform I have to talk about what I believe is important. And you know what? This movie's fucking important. 10 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you particularly to my patrons, my mom, Hamrain Marco, Kat Zaracata, Benjamin Schiff, Anthony Cole, @BlasianFMA, Magnolia Denton, Elliot Fowler, and Greg Lucina. If you like this video, that's great. If not, go fuck yourself. If you want to see more, please subscribe. I hope to see you next week.